She asked me to pretend I was her husband for one phone call, and I said yes before she'd even finished explaining why, which tells you something about either my judgment or my willingness to be talked into things by someone with pleading eyes in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, possibly both. The call was supposed to last 5 minutes. It lasted 40. By the end of it, I had invented an entire marriage. A honeymoon in Portugal that never happened. A small dispute about whether we wanted children that I improvised on the spot and somehow resolved in real time. And a level of familiarity with a complete stranger that should not be possible to manufacture convincingly in under an hour. I had given this stranger a name, a job, a proposal story, complete with rain and a specific moment of nervous courage, and a recipe for a marriage that, 4 minutes earlier, hadn't existed in any form at all. I hung up the phone, handed it back to her, and she looked at me with an expression I would spend the next several months trying to fully understand, and said, "I think we just got married better than my actual engagement went." I had no idea. In that moment, sitting in a coffee shop with foam art going cold in front of me, that the fictional marriage I'd just performed for a stranger was about to become considerably less fictional than either of us expected. Let me take you back to the beginning of that Tuesday, because the phone call doesn't make sense without understanding what led up to it. My name is Sam. I'm 28 years old. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means my schedule is flexible in a way that occasionally lands me in coffee shops on weekday afternoons, doing nothing in particular except enjoying the specific freedom of not being chained to an office. I'd been at this particular cafe for about 2 hours that Tuesday, working through a logo concept for a client who kept changing their mind, when a woman at the next table started having what I could only describe as a visibly escalating crisis on her phone. Not a call yet. Just the agitated scrolling and typing of someone bracing for one. She was maybe my age, dark curly hair pulled into a hasty bun, wearing the kind of professional casual outfit that suggested she'd come from work or was heading there. And she had the specific tense posture of someone steeling themselves for something unpleasant. I should say something about my own life at that point, because it matters for understanding why I said yes to something so objectively strange. I'd been freelancing for almost 3 years, which gave me a great deal of flexibility and considerably less daily human contact than I'd had in any job before it. Most of my conversations happened over email or in brief client calls. I worked from cafes partly for the change of scenery and partly, I think, because I missed the low-stakes background hum of other people existing near me, even if I never spoke to most of them. I had been single for about a year, not unhappily, just without much active effort toward changing it. The same kind of comfortable drift that happens when independence starts to feel less like a choice and more like a default setting you've stopped questioning. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But the cafe was quiet, and she wasn't being particularly quiet about her distress, muttering things under her breath that included phrases like, "This is insane," and "she's going to ask." She always asks, with enough volume that I caught most of it without trying. At some point, she put her phone down, exhaled hard, and looked directly at me with the specific, desperate focus of someone who has just decided a stranger is about to become relevant to her immediate problem. "This is going to sound completely unhinged," she said, "but I need to ask you something, and I need you to say yes before I explain it. Because if I explain it first, you're going to say no. That's not generally how good decisions get made," I said. "But go ahead. My grandmother is about to call me. She thinks I got married 4 months ago. I did not get married 4 months ago. I told her I did because she was in the hospital and stressed about whether I'd ever settle down, as she puts it, and the lie just sort of happened. And now it's been 4 months, and she keeps asking to talk to my husband, and I keep saying he's busy. And today she said if she doesn't talk to him this week, she's calling my mother to ask why. And my mother does not know about any of this. And the entire structure is about to collapse, unless someone who sounds vaguely like a reasonable husband answers this phone in approximately 10 minutes and has a normal conversation with my 83-year-old grandmother. I sat with that for a moment, processing the sheer scale of the situation she'd just described. The kind of elaborate, accidental fiction that builds itself one small lie at a time until it requires actual theatrical production to sustain. "You want me to be your husband on the phone?" I said. For one call. For one call. That's it. I will never ask you for anything else in my life. I will pay you. I will buy you coffee for a year. I just need 10 minutes of you sounding like a reasonable, kind person who is married to me. I should tell you, in the interest of full honesty, that there were several reasonable responses available to me in that moment, and saying yes was not obviously the best one. I could have said this wasn't my problem, which would have been true. I could have suggested she simply tell her grandmother the truth, which would have been the actually sensible advice. I could have, at minimum, asked a few more clarifying questions before committing to playing a fictional husband on a phone call with a real, elderly, presumably perceptive woman who'd known her granddaughter for 28 years and would presumably notice if something felt off. Instead, I looked at her, genuinely panicked, genuinely out of better options. 4 months deep into a lie that had clearly stopped being funny to her a while ago. And I thought about my own grandmother, who had died 2 years earlier and who I would have done almost anything to have one more slightly invented conversation with, and I said, "Okay, what's my name?" There's a version of this story where my answer requires more deliberation, where I ask follow-up questions about the risks, where I behave the way a sensible person behaves when a stranger asks them to participate in an elaborate, ongoing deception involving a vulnerable elderly relative. I didn't do any of that. I said yes the way you say yes to things you don't fully understand the weight of yet. Propelled less by logic and more by some instinct I couldn't have explained cleanly at the time. Something about her specific desperation reminding me of my own desperation, 2 years earlier, to have just one more ordinary conversation with someone I'd already lost. Her face did something complicated. Relief, disbelief, gratitude all arriving at once. And she said, "David, you're David. We met at a work conference. We've been together 2 years, married 4 months. Her name is Eleanor. She's sharp. She'll ask questions, and she loves Portugal, so if it comes up, we honeymoon there." Did we? We did now. Anything else I should know? Any details that have already come up that I'd be expected to remember? She thought for a second, visibly cataloging the 4 months of accumulated fiction. "She thinks you're an architect." I don't know why I said architect, it just came out, and now it's load-bearing, if you'll forgive the pun. She thinks we got married at a small ceremony, just immediate family, because you're both private people. She thinks your parents live out of state, which is conveniently true of your actual parents, probably, statistically. And she thinks you call her Eleanor and not Grandma or anything cutesy, because I told her once that you found her too dignified for nicknames, which she loved, so please maintain that. Architect, small ceremony, dignified Eleanor. Got it. You're taking this remarkably well. I contain unexpected reserves of improvisational confidence, I said, apparently only accessible in moments of total strangeness. The phone rang less than 2 minutes later. Maya, that was her name. She'd told me quickly while we waited. Maya Castellano, and I was apparently now Maya Castellano's husband, David. Took a breath, answered, did the bright, careful voice of someone performing normalcy for a beloved elderly relative, and within 90 seconds had handed the phone to me with a look that said, very clearly, "Please don't let this fall apart." "David," Eleanor said, the moment I said hello, with the specific warmth of someone who had been waiting months for this exact conversation. Finally. I was starting to think Maya was hiding you. "Just a busy few months, I'm afraid," I said, settling into a voice that felt, against all reason, immediately natural. "Work's been relentless. I'm sorry it's taken this long." "Well, you sound lovely," Eleanor said, which struck me as a generous assessment based on 4 words. "Tell me everything. How did you two actually meet?" Maya's version changes every time I ask. I think she's testing whether I'm paying attention. I glanced at Maya, who had gone slightly pale, mouthing conference at me with increasing urgency. "We met at a work conference," I said. "Marketing and design, actually. I was presenting." She asked a question that made me realize she'd clearly read my work beforehand, which I found, frankly, more attractive than I probably should admit to her grandmother. Eleanor laughed, delighted, and Maya's expression shifted from panic into something closer to disbelief that this was actually working. For the next several minutes, Eleanor asked the kind of specific, loving, slightly invasive questions that grandmothers ask about the wedding, which I described in details I was inventing in real time based on the small, frantic hand gestures Maya was making across the table, about the honeymoon, which apparently had involved Portugal, a city called Sintra that I'd somehow remembered from a documentary, and a minor disaster involving lost luggage that I made up because it felt like the kind of detail a real story would have, about whether we were thinking about children, a question I answered with careful, diplomatic vagueness that seemed to satisfy without committing to anything Maya would later have to walk back. "Tell me about the proposal," Eleanor said at one point, with the specific eagerness of someone who'd clearly been waiting months to hear this detail told properly. Maya's version was very short. "I want yours." I glanced at Maya, who mouthed something I couldn't quite parse, her eyes wide with the particular panic of someone realizing the story was about to get considerably more specific than she'd prepared for. "I'm not sure my version will be better," I said, buying time. But I remember it being raining, actually. We'd gone for a walk, and it started raining harder than we expected. And instead of running for cover, we just stood there getting soaked. And I thought, well, I might as well ask now, because I don't think I'm going to feel braver than I do standing in the rain looking ridiculous. There was a pause on the line. And then Eleanor said quietly, "That's lovely. That's much better than what she told me, which was just, he asked, and I said yes," which frankly sounded like she was rushing me off the phone. Maya, across the table, had both hands over her mouth, somewhere between horror and barely contained laughter. "You handle her questions well?" Eleanor said, a bit later with what sounded like genuine appraisal. "Patient. That's good. Maya needs someone patient. She runs hot, that one, has since she was small." "I've noticed," I said, looking at Maya, who rolled her eyes but was visibly fighting a smile. The call went on. Eleanor told a long story about Maya's grandfather, who had died several years earlier, about how he would have loved meeting David, about a specific dish he used to make that she wanted to teach Maya to cook so she could make it for me. A slow-braised something. The recipe handed down imprecisely the way family recipes always are, more feeling than measurement. I listened to all of it with what I can only describe as genuine attention, not performed attention. There was something in the way Eleanor talked about her late husband, the specific texture of 40 years of marriage condensed into a 5-minute anecdote about a recipe, that I found myself actually moved by, fictional husband or not. "You're very easy to talk to," Eleanor said near the end. "I'm glad Maya found you. I worried, you know, after everything with that last one, the one who wasn't kind to her. I worried she'd stopped believing someone decent existed." I looked at Maya when Eleanor said that. She wasn't making frantic hand gestures anymore. She was just watching me, very still, an expression on her face that had stopped being about the performance entirely. "She found someone decent," I said, and I meant it as something other than a line in a script. Though I couldn't have told you exactly what I meant by it yet, we said our goodbyes. Eleanor told me to take care of her granddaughter, and I said I would, and Maya took the phone back, said a few final loving things and hung up, and then set the phone down on the table between us with the careful precision of someone defusing something. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The cafe around us continued on. Oblivious. Someone ordered a complicated drink at the counter. A barista called out a name. The ordinary hum of a weekday afternoon, completely unaware of what had just occurred at our small table. I noticed in that moment of silence that my hands had gone slightly stiff from gripping the phone, that I'd been more tense throughout the call than I'd registered while it was happening, the particular delayed exhaustion that arrives once a performance ends and the body finally permits itself to register the effort it cost. "That was 40 minutes, Maya said finally, looking at the call timer. "I told you 5. You undersold the assignment. I genuinely did not expect you to be that good at it." She looked at me with something between awe and suspicion. "Have you done this before?" Is this a service you offer? This is the first time I've invented an entire marriage for a stranger's grandmother. I want that on the record. She laughed, really laughed, the tension of the last 20 minutes breaking all at once, and put her face in her hands for a second, before looking back up at me. I think we just got married better than my actual engagement went, she said. I'm engaged. Was engaged. It ended badly, around the time the David thing started, which is honestly not unrelated to why the lie happened in the first place. I couldn't stand telling my grandmother the truth on top of everything else that fell apart that month. I sat with that for a moment, understanding the shape of the situation more fully now. Not just an accidental lie that had spiraled, but a lie born out of genuine grief that had needed somewhere safe to land. I'm sorry, I said. About the engagement, I mean. Not about being your husband. I think I did a respectable job as your husband. You did an excellent job as my husband, she said. David, whoever that was. I might have actually married him based on this performance. I'll let him know you said that. Next time I channel him. We sat there for another hour after that. The coffee long cold, the logo client's revisions completely forgotten. Talking the way you talk to someone after you've just survived something slightly absurd together, easily, without performance. The specific bond that forms between two people who've shared a strange experience and come out the other side of it laughing. She told me more about the engagement, about a man who'd seemed right for years and then revealed, slowly and then all at once, that he wasn't, and about the specific loneliness of having to explain that unraveling to people who'd been excited for her. The worst part, she said, turning her cold coffee cup slowly on the table, wasn't even the breakup itself. It was the calls. Telling my mom. Telling my friends. Watching everyone's face do that specific fall when they realize they have to recalibrate something they'd already gotten excited about. By the time it got to Eleanor, and she was in the hospital that week, genuinely unwell, scared, I just couldn't make myself add one more disappointed face to the pile. So I told her the wedding had happened instead of telling her it had fallen apart before it started. It felt kinder in the moment. It got considerably less kind by month 3. I told her about my own grandmother, about how genuinely meaningful it had been, in a way I hadn't expected, to spend 40 minutes being warmly interrogated by an elderly woman who clearly loved her family with her whole heart. My grandmother used to ask exactly those kinds of questions, I said. The proposal story, the specific details, wanting the version with feeling in it rather than just the facts. I hadn't thought about her that intensely in a while. So thank you for that, weirdly, even though it required me to invent a husband. I think that might be the strangest thank you I've ever received, Maya said. I contain multitudes, I said. Echoing something I didn't yet know would become a private joke between us. Though it would, eventually. Repeated back and forth so many times it stopped needing explanation. Eleanor's going to want to talk to you again, Maya said, somewhere into the second hour. I should warn you now. She's going to bring up Portugal again. She's already planning a trip there to see where we honeymooned? We should probably actually go to Portugal at some point, I said, just so the story has some basis in reality. Maya looked at me for a long moment. Is that a real suggestion or a bit? I thought about it, genuinely, for a second longer than the question maybe warranted. I don't entirely know, I said. Ask me again after we've actually had a date that wasn't accidentally a wedding. Is that what you're asking for? A date? I think I might be, yes. She smiled, slow and real, the same smile that had broken through the panic 40 minutes earlier when David had apparently said the right thing about meeting at a conference. David set a pretty high bar, she said. Sam's going to have to work to live up to him. I invented David in real time over the course of one phone call. I think Sam can manage a normal dinner. We went to dinner that Friday, an actual date, no fictional grandmother involved. Just two people getting to know each other properly after having improbably skipped several normal stages of acquaintance by way of an entire invented marriage. It was, by any reasonable measure, a strange way to begin getting to know someone, and also, somehow, an unusually efficient one. We'd already weathered a high-pressure shared performance together, already seen each other handle an unexpected crisis with humor instead of panic, already built the specific trust that comes from successfully co-authoring a fiction under time pressure. Most people spend months learning whether someone is good in a crisis. We'd learned it in 40 minutes, live, with an audience of one elderly grandmother who'd unknowingly auditioned us both. I picked a restaurant a few blocks from the cafe, a small place with mismatched chairs and a menu that changed depending on what the owner had found at the market that morning. And I remember being more deliberate about the choice than I would normally be for a first date, wanting the setting to feel unhurried rather than performative, the opposite of the high-stakes improvisation that had brought us together in the first place. Maya arrived a few minutes late, apologizing, explaining she'd gotten turned around 2 blocks from a restaurant she'd apparently passed 100 times, and there was something disarming about watching her be slightly flustered in an ordinary, low-stakes way after I'd only ever seen her handle genuine crisis with composure. "This is strange," she said, once we'd settled in. "I feel like I should know you already. We've technically been married for a month. 4 months, if you count the part before I existed. 4 months and 1 very intense phone call," she agreed. "And yet I don't actually know your last name." "Whitfield," I said. "Sam Whitfield. Graphic designer, not architect, despite what Eleanor believes. Maya Castellano. Marketing coordinator, not a grieving widow's accomplice in an elaborate hoax, despite what it might look like from the outside." We ordered too much food and talked through all of it, the conversation moving easily from the absurd into the genuinely personal, the way conversations do once 2 people have already proven to each other they can handle absurdity without flinching. She asked about my actual grandmother, the real one, and I found myself telling her things I hadn't said out loud in the 2 years since the funeral. Small, specific memories. The particular sound of her laugh, the way she used to test whoever I was dating with a series of disguised, deceptively casual questions designed to reveal character. "She would have loved this," Maya said when I finished. "The whole story. She would have asked you 100 follow-up questions about David. She would have figured out I was lying within about 90 seconds, I said. She had no patience for performance. She always knew. "Then I suppose it's good she wasn't on the other end of that call," Maya said. Eleanor's sharp, but she wanted to believe it. That's different from actually being fooled. I thought about that distinction for the rest of the dinner. The difference between Eleanor wanting, genuinely, for her granddaughter to have found someone good, and being willing, in that wanting, to accept a story that gave her exactly what she hoped for. It didn't feel like deception exactly, not anymore. It felt like something closer to a wish that had simply needed somewhere to land before it became true. We ended the evening walking back toward her apartment. The late evening air cool enough to need jackets. Neither of us in any particular hurry to end the conversation. At her door, she turned to look at me with an expression that had shifted, somewhere over the course of the evening, from cautious amusement into something more deliberate. "This is the part," she said, "where I have to decide whether to invite you up, and I'm aware that under normal circumstances I'd be more careful about a first date, but I feel like we skipped several stages of normal circumstance about a month ago over a phone call to my grandmother." "We did skip a few stages." I agreed. "So I'm choosing to interpret that as a kind of accelerated trust," she said. "For better or worse?" "For better," I said. "I think we've already established that, statistically, this approach is working out." She laughed and invited me up anyway, and the evening that followed had none of the strangeness of how we'd met, and all of the ordinary, specific warmth of 2 people who'd simply decided somewhere along the way that they liked each other enough to stop being careful about it. Eleanor called again 3 weeks later, and this time Maya didn't ask me to come over and perform. She just handed me the phone mid-conversation. Naturally, the way you'd hand a phone to an actual spouse who happened to be in the room, and said, "David, tell her about the apartment," referring to an apartment we did not actually share, that I improvised details about with the same easy confidence as the first call, mentioning a window with good light that Maya, listening, started laughing silently into a couch cushion because apparently I'd accidentally described her actual apartment's actual window with suspicious accuracy. "How's the architecture going, David?" Eleanor asked partway through, and I answered with a vague, confident sentence about a commercial project I was apparently overseeing, drawing loosely on actual graphic design deadlines I'd had that week, translated into a profession I didn't actually have. Maya tells me you're very dedicated. Sometimes too dedicated, she says. You work too many late nights. I'm trying to get better about that, I said, which was, strangely, also true of my actual freelance habits, fictional architect or not. Good, Eleanor said. Family matters more than buildings, even good ones. When I hung up, Maya was sitting on the couch with her knees pulled up, watching me with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last 20 minutes, from amusement into something quieter. You're getting better at this, she said. I'm method acting, I said. I've started actually paying attention to your apartment's light situation. That's either very romantic or extremely strange. I've decided it's both, and I've stopped trying to separate the two. We'd been seeing each other steadily by then, the kind of relationship that had built itself with unusual speed, but also, somehow unusual solidity. There'd been a foundation laid early, under strange circumstances that most couples don't get the chance to test until much further in. We already knew, in a way most people take months to learn, that the other person could handle pressure with humor instead of panic, could improvise gracefully when a situation went sideways, could be trusted with something as fragile as another person's carefully maintained fiction. It made the ordinary getting-to-know-you stage feel almost unnecessary in places, like we were filling in details around a structure that had already proven sound. There was a particular evening, about 6 weeks in, when Maya asked me, somewhat out of nowhere, whether I'd ever actually meant any of it, the specific things David had said on that first call, the proposal story with the rain, the small, careful answer about children. I know you were improvising, she said, but some of it felt like it came from somewhere real. I've wondered about that. I thought about the question honestly before answering. I think some of it was improvised the way good improvisation usually is, I said. You pull from things that are already true and reshape them slightly to fit the moment. The rain story, I don't know where that came from exactly, but I remember thinking, as I said it, that I'd actually like to propose to someone that way someday, unplanned, a little ridiculous. Not because the moment called for grandness, but because waiting for a better moment felt like a worse idea than just doing it imperfectly right then. I paused. I don't think I was lying exactly. I think I was telling Eleanor about a version of myself I hadn't fully met yet. Maya was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That might be the most honest thing anyone's ever said about a lie." I've had some time to think about it. She studied me for a while after that. The specific assessing look she got when something mattered more than the conversation's tone suggested. And then she said simply, "I'm glad it was you who answered that phone." I didn't have anything clever to say back to that, so I just said I was glad too, and we let the moment be exactly as simple as it needed to be. 2 months in, Eleanor asked when she'd finally get to meet me in person, a question that arrived with the specific weight of someone who'd clearly waited long enough and wasn't going to keep waiting indefinitely. Maya and I had, by then, been on enough real dates that the question landed less like a logistical problem and more like an opportunity, though it required us to finally have the conversation. We'd both been quietly avoiding what exactly we were going. To tell Eleanor about how David and the man actually dating Maya had become the same. Increasingly real person. We'd been seeing each other steadily by then. The kind of relationship that had built itself with unusual speed, but also, somehow, unusual solidity. There'd been a foundation laid early, under strange circumstances that most couples don't get the chance to test until much further in. We already knew, in a way most people take months to learn, that the other person could handle pressure with humor instead of panic, could improvise gracefully when a situation went sideways, could be trusted with something as fragile as another person's carefully maintained fiction. It made the ordinary getting-to-know-you stage feel almost unnecessary in places, like we were filling in details around a structure that had already proven sound, I think, Maya said, the evening we finally discussed it properly. Sitting on her couch with the window I'd apparently described with suspicious accuracy, letting in the last of the evening light, we tell her the truth, not all of it. Just the part where the lie accidentally became real, because I think that's actually a better story than the fake one, if I'm honest. You think she'll be upset about the original lie? I think she'll be thrilled that the fake husband turned into a real one without her having to do any of the work of finding him herself, Maya said. She's going to take an obnoxious amount of credit for this somehow, despite having no idea any of it was happening. She was right. When we visited Eleanor together, the actual first meeting, months after the phone call that started everything, and told her the real version, the genuine accidental fiction into fact story, Eleanor laughed for a solid 2 minutes before composing herself enough to say, "Well, I always said you sounded lovely. I just didn't realize how literally my granddaughter would take that assessment." And then, looking between us with an expression of genuine, unhurried satisfaction. "I knew there was something different about the way she talked about you, even when you weren't real yet. You can hear it, you know. When someone's describing a person they're actually starting to feel something for, even if they're calling it practice." We sat in her small, sunlit living room for the rest of the afternoon, Eleanor asking the real questions now instead of the rehearsed ones. And there was something specifically moving about watching Maya answer them honestly, not performing details I'd invented over a phone line, but actually describing the way things had unfolded. The dinner Friday, the apartment window joke, the slow accumulation of 2 months that had turned a favor into something neither of us had expected. Eleanor reached over at one point and took my hand, briefly, the way you'd welcome someone properly into a family that had already, unknowingly, half-adopted you months earlier. "David was a good story," she said, patting my hand once before letting go. "Sam is better. I'm glad you turned out to be the same person." "Eventually. It took some work," I said. "Everything worth having does," Eleanor said, and went to put the kettle on, leaving Maya and me alone for a moment in the sunlit living room, both of us slightly stunned at how cleanly the whole improbable thing had resolved itself. I think about that phone call often, the specific absurdity of inventing an entire marriage, in real time for a woman I'd met 20 minutes earlier, the honeymoon in Portugal that didn't exist until I needed it to, the small improvised details that somehow, against every reasonable expectation, ended up mattering. There's a version of that Tuesday where I say no, where the request is simply too strange to agree to, where Maya finds some other way to manage her grandmother's call, and I finish my coffee and go back to my logo revisions and never think about her again. I don't know what that version of my life looks like, and I've stopped trying to imagine it, because the actual version involves an apartment with good window light that I described accurately before I'd ever actually seen it, a grandmother who takes credit for a relationship she had no idea was forming, and a fictional husband named David who, as it turns out, eventually just became me. We did go to Portugal, eventually, almost a year after that first phone call. Not a honeymoon, not yet, just a trip. Because Eleanor had never stopped mentioning Sintra, and we both wanted to actually see the place I'd invented from half-remembered documentary footage. It was, we agreed, considerably better in person than in my improvised version, though I maintained that my version had the advantage of not involving any actual lost luggage, which Maya pointed out meant my fictional honeymoon had technically gone smoother than our real vacation, since an airline did, in fact, misplace one of our bags for 2 genuinely stressful days. We stood on a hillside overlooking Sintra's colored rooftops on the second afternoon, the misplaced bag finally recovered and forgiven, and Maya called Eleanor on video, propping the phone against a low stone wall so the whole scene was visible. The hills, the light, the two of us standing close together in a place that had existed first as a fiction and now, finally, as somewhere we'd actually stood. Eleanor's face on the small screen did something soft and pleased that neither of us commented on directly, though we both noticed it. "It's exactly like you described," Eleanor said to me, meaning the original phone call, the lost luggage story, the honeymoon that had only existed in words until that moment. "I always wondered if you'd embellished." "I embellished considerably," I admitted. "But it turns out the real version doesn't need much help. It's better than what I invented." "David's honeymoon was better," Maya said, after we'd hung up standing on the hillside with the wind moving gently around us, But I think I prefer this one anyway. Lost luggage and all? High praise, I said, considering David set quite a precedent. David doesn't exist, she said. You do. I'll take the real, slightly chaotic version every time. We walked back down from the hillside as the light started to go gold and then gray, taking the long way through narrow streets neither of us had a map for, in no particular hurry to find our way back. There was something fitting, I thought, about getting slightly lost together in the same city I'd once invented from nothing, as if the place itself understood that this story had always preferred the improvised path to the planned one, and was simply continuing the pattern. I think Eleanor knew that too, somehow, long before either of us said it out loud, that the realest things often arrive disguised as something smaller, something improvised, something that started as a favor for a stranger in a coffee shop and ended up, one phone call at a time, becoming the truest thing in the room.